When We Disagree is a show about arguments, how we have them, why we have them, and their impact on our relationships and ourselves. Let's say you and I are talking about movies, and I offer this hot take. I don't think Scarlett Johansson is a very good actress. You, a huge fan of Johansson's, are blown away. I continue on and I mention that I saw her in movies like Fly Me to the Moon and Asteroid City, and I didn't like her performance in either. You say, that's it? Those are the movies of hers you saw and you came to that conclusion? And I say, yep, you got it. That's exactly right. You can probably see where my hypothetical criticism is going. I base my claim about Johansson on A, insufficient evidence. She has starred in dozens of movies since breaking out in Lost in Translation in 2003, and I only mentioned 2 before kind of completely dismissing her. And then B, there's no rhyme or reason to my choice of the movies that I looked at. It seems like I had just happened to see 2 fairly recent ones of hers, but I left out all the others. And I certainly left out other critically acclaimed ones like Jojo Rabbit or Marriage Story or Her. And C, I don't have a standard for good or bad acting. All told, what my criticism of Johansson lacks is a method. And if we're trying to figure out what separates reasonable and rational arguments from those that are unreasonable and irrational, looking at the method is very useful. A method should be predictable, a set, step-by-step course of analysis, and it should be reproducible by others. So if I came back to you and I said, I think Scarlett Johansson plays the same role over and over, and I came to that conclusion after watching all of her critically acclaimed starring roles in her career, we might still disagree. This is a matter of taste after all, but you might concede that I have some sufficient evidence, and I've been faithful at least to assessing her career, and you could replicate my study and see for yourself. I'm Michael Lee, Professor of Communication and Director of the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston. Our guest today on When We Disagree is Annie Andrews. She's a pediatrician, a mom of 3, and the founder of Their Future PAC, our nation's first and only political action committee for kids. Annie, tell us an argument story.
So I want to take us back to the fall of 2022 when I was the Democratic nominee for Congress in South Carolina's 1st District. And this was really at the peak of the South Carolina GOP's attack on transgender youth in our community. And as a current candidate for Congress at the time, I was in the crosshairs of this attack, which was harmful to some of the most vulnerable children in our community. And my opponent, our current Congresswoman Nancy Mace, joined in on the attack and called me a child abuser and attacked this community in ways that were deeply harmful. And at the time, I was an employee of the Medical University of South Carolina, and I looked to them to defend the evidence-based care that we provide for these youth. And I asked them to do that, and many people did, and they did not stand up for this vulnerable community. So we disagreed about how to protect these kids.
Your employer, not just you and the Republicans who were attacking you, but you and your employer.
Correct.
Will you talk a bit about, and I want to get to the dispute over evidence-based care with the employer. Will you talk a little bit about what puts you in the political crosshairs of aside from running for office, but on this issue specifically?
So as a member of the American Academy of Pediatrics and a child advocate, I had previously advocated to protect this community that was under attack by Republicans in the state of South Carolina and all across this country. And then during the campaign, Nancy Mace's first line of attack on me was to call me a child abuser for supporting gender affirming care. So it became really a center point of my political campaign. And because I was an employee at our local children's hospital, the problem grew much bigger than that.
In your estimation, having run for office and faced these withering attacks from the right on trans issues broadly, what is so activating to their audience, to their core audience about this issue?
They don't understand trans people, and they don't try to understand trans people. They are some of the most vulnerable members of our community, and the GOP is always looking for a new cultural wedge issue. And because they have lost the American people on the abortion issue, they know that the vast majority of Americans are not with them on that issue. They search for a new issue, and that was attacking a vulnerable population, which is trans kids specifically.
Yeah, you mentioned it's a lack of understanding and ignorance. And I wonder if you think there's perhaps more too, because lots of us are super ignorant about Norwegians, but Norwegians seldom come up in South Carolina politics, much less national politics.
Yeah, I mean, trans people make people uncomfortable, people who aren't willing to open their mind and learn about something that they're not familiar with. They're
Right.
such an easy target. They have been demonized in mainstream media. And it's, but they're humans. I always say I support trans kids because I support all kids. They're just kids, they're people. And to me, the default should always be to defend vulnerable people, but that, on the other hand, other people see that as an opportunity for attack, an opportunity to gain votes, to get clicks on social media. And it's just disgusting.
In the context of these attacks and in the context of this contentious election, you said you looked to your employer to provide some defense against their attacks. What were you hoping they would say?
All I was searching for was a public statement saying that as a children's hospital, we are tasked with serving all children in South Carolina. And part of that includes serving transgender youth in South Carolina. And we follow evidence-based practice when we treat these youth, just like we do for all the other youth.
Uh-huh. And then in that moment, when they didn't issue the statement, I presume, describe the kind of conflict, both interpersonally, morally, ideologically, with you and your employer.
So I think I know I was naive at the time. And it was one of those situations where I thought, well, if I just go meet with the leaders and explain why I think it's so important for them to do this, surely they'll come around. Surely there's some secret plan I don't know about for them to step up and rise to the occasion and defend these patients. And I had meetings with leaders. And what I was told is we can't get involved because it's a political campaign, which is, I wasn't asking them to say we defend Annie Andrews against Nancy Mace. I was asking them to defend this vulnerable population. They said that the reason they were staying silent was so that they could protect their ability to give these children care. And as I'm sure you are aware, they don't do that anymore. So that's not what they were doing. They also abandoned the patients and no longer provide gender affirming care. So if they were staying silent so that they can continue to provide this care, then, they failed.
Did you feel, I mean, I'm putting words in your mouth, and feel free to disagree. If I was there, I can imagine you come to these meetings with a kind of faith in reason that the force of the better argument, to take a term, would win the day, that they would see the light of your case, the morality of your case, the sensibility of your case, and have no choice but to do the right thing. And so describe your feeling. I called it disillusionment, but perhaps it's something else.
I think it was a heartbreaking experience. Yeah. It was disappointing and heartbreaking. And now that I have some distance from it, incredibly alarming, because we have seen this infiltration of politics into healthcare. Healthcare, there should be a wall between healthcare science and politics. And I really just couldn't believe it, because I had spent near 15 years working for that institution, and I believed in the institution. And I thought they believed in me. And I thought we were on the same page about serving all children. And it was just so disheartening. And I still don't think I've processed the whole thing, honestly. I tell this story sometimes and I see other people's reactions, and I just don't think there's so much here that I haven't even dealt with internally.
Clarify what you mean by you would favor a wall between healthcare science and politics, meaning that healthcare science should not be part of a political football that's kicked around during an election, or that healthcare science shouldn't be the province of regulation.
The first one, that I see politicians infiltrating our once lauded medical institutions, which should be guided solely based on data, evidence, evidence-based policy. And that's how they should decide how they treat patients. But rather, now we have one political party that is telling the healthcare providers how they can treat patients, even when it flies in the face of what our evidence base tells us to do.
What do you think the leadership at your employer was trying to avoid? In other words, they ended up, it sounds like, changing their practices anyway, even though they claimed that this was protective, it was avoidant. So what were they trying to do? Who were they trying to pacify?
I ask myself that all the time. And I tell people, if someone's telling you to be quiet or to stop advocating for what you're advocating for when you're protecting vulnerable people, who are they trying to protect? And they're
Hmm.
trying to protect their relationship with the South Carolina GOP. There's a relationship between the Freedom Caucus and the Board of Trustees at MUSC, and they listen to them and they're trying to maintain that relationship. They may say they're trying to stay out of legal trouble, but the reason they get into legal trouble is they don't show up at the State House and advocate against these non-scientific abortion bans, against these non-scientific gender affirming care bans. And so they make themselves politically powerless by bowing down to the politically powerful, and they just get rolled over. And I was looking for someone in the room to be brave for these kids, and no one stood up and did that.
For those members of our audience who are not as close to this issue as you are, can you talk a bit about what evidence-based care is and what the attacks on it are?
Specifically for for trans kids?
Exactly,
Yeah.
as you've used it, yeah.
Yeah. So, gender affirming care simply means creating a welcoming environment for gender non-conforming youth so that they have a safe place to go and seek medical care. And so that the parents together with the child can talk through what's happening. And maybe it starts with a little boy who was born a male and starts identifying as a female, wanting to present, in a more feminine way. And they need someone to talk to, whether it's a mental health professional or their pediatrician. And the bulk of gender affirming care for youth is simply that. And I crudely say it's not being an a-hole to kids. It's creating a safe and welcoming environment for these kids. And then as they reach puberty, gender affirming care, evidence-based gender affirming care can include the prescription of hormone blockers so that they don't go through puberty as the gender that they do not identify as, and then cross-sex hormones later. But that is a subset of these kids that always happens after many, many, many meetings with pediatricians, endocrinologists, mental health providers. And that is what gender affirming care looks like. And I think it's really important to say that no youth in South Carolina has ever had gender affirming surgery. That is not a thing that happens in South Carolina. It never has been.
And then you were called a child abuser. What is the rationale, if there is one, for that allegation?
I guess it's that their talking point is that, doing what I just said, providing this care, which I should also say the reason it's evidence-based is because it's been shown to reduce the incidence and frequency of suicide and suicidal ideation in trans youth. And so it's not just, there's so many important reasons to do this care.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So that's the argument then is it's not just about fulfilling desire. In other words, I would like to present more femininely, but instead we know from evidence-based research that suicidal ideation, mental health problems, etc., isolation, withdrawal are much higher in this vulnerable population. And so we need ameliorative remedial care here. And that is what evidence-based care is in this case.
That's exactly right. And like I said, I support trans kids because I support all kids, but I'm also so passionate about this issue because me and my colleagues are the ones who take care of these kids when they do try to harm themselves and they show up at a children's hospital, and that because they're being bullied by an adult in their life or they don't have an adult to support them. And so I'm the one who has to stand at their bedside after they've taken a giant handful of Tylenol trying to end their life. And this is, these are real people in our community. And that's why I was so, I think, brokenhearted to see the way my employer did not stand up for them and the way our congresswoman was willing to just throw this population under the bus to score political points.
What are the potential consequences of bans on this kind of evidence-based care?
So specifically for youth, it's, isolationism, like you said, an increase of suicidal ideation and suicidality and suicide attempts. Mm-hmm. Logistically, they're just, they have to now seek care in other states. And then the disparities widen because you have to have a certain amount of resources and wherewithal for your parent to be able to identify a provider outside of the state of South Carolina who can continue to give this care. And of course, South Carolina has stopped, MUSC has stopped all gender affirming care, including for adults. So we have adults in our community who are, scrambling to find a provider outside of South Carolina who can continue their medications that they've been on many times for years.
As we close, I'm noticing that, there are at least 3 different massive and intertwined arguments going on at the same time here. One, of course, is your being in the crosshairs in a contentious election for national office. Another is with you and your employer over validating existing care practices in public. And then a third one, of course, is the ideological and moral issue over this kind of care much more broadly. As you think about each of these 3 and your experience in this election just a few years ago, what are some of the lasting lessons that stick with you?
We have to be brave, specifically for our kids when they are the subject of these attacks. We have to be willing to lose some things if it's a fight that's important enough for us. And and I think very specifically this applies to everybody. Your job won't love you back. Like, no matter what you feel like you've given to your employer, no matter how hard you work, no matter how dedicated you are, none of that matters, because politics is politics and business is business. And so you have to make decisions and take actions that you can sleep with at night, that can allow you to sleep peacefully at night, that can, allow you to feel proud of how you acted in this incredibly contentious moment in national politics, that our children can ask us what we did in this moment, and that we can be proud and confident in what we did, and that we have the power to stand up for vulnerable people, all of us, not just me because I was running for office, but all of us can use our voices to protect vulnerable people who are being attacked by, non-well-meaning politicians.
Annie Andrews, thank you so much for being on When We Disagree.
Thank you for having me.
When We Disagree is recorded at the College of Charleston with creator and host Michael Lee. Recording and sound engineering by Jesse Kunz and Lance Laidlaw. Reach out to us at whenwedisagree@gmail.com.